Makes it sound like we're skipping the updates.
Well, we're skipping the updates to the skip update, that's right.
Just a moment to screen share here, we should.
Great, thank you. Well, nice to see you all. For the record, I'm Bridget Budville. I'm staff here at the CJC. And I think perfect. Okay, great. Well, I'm here to give you what's called the BURN State Crisis Intervention Program update. It is essentially an extension of the federal BURN program that we all know and has existed for quite a while. This is a narrower focus. It's on gun violence reduction. The big update here, this is all information you've probably seen before, but we were awarded the grant. We did get notified by BJA that the state of Oregon will receive its federal formula allocation, which is great. It's not a ton of money in the grand scheme of things, so I'll get to that in a bit about how we're going to try to leverage these funds with other projects that are ongoing that fund gun violence reduction in our state as well. And just as a little bit of a reminder, we haven't quite dialed into this yet. We have an orientation with BJA coming up, but eligible state subawardees include state agencies, local governments, federally recognized tribal governments, and community-based groups.
Bridget, point it here.
Right.
Oh, sorry.
It should. There you go. It's thinking about it.
Okay.
Maybe not.
They worked once. I have the defective Hogwarts wand.
There you go.
Okay, great. So again, this is a bit of review, but just as a reminder, the federal government did prioritize 4 types of programs when they created this opportunity. Extreme risk protection orders, and you have to be a state where this law already existed to be eligible to use funds towards this. You couldn't use this money to create an ERPO statute if you didn't have one. We do, and have for about 6 years. It's not required that you pursue that, but that's again one of the priorities. Court-based programs, so things like specialty courts that would admit folks who are either have gun charges pending, which is honestly pretty rare for specialty courts, but it would also allow you to fund things like veterans courts where your participants might be more likely to have be a victim of gun violence or perpetuate gun violence given their circumstances. Behavioral health deflection programs, and then funding for law enforcement, safe storage, tracking, and some sort of relinquishment program. They also give you this catch-all that you can use it for related gun violence programs and initiatives, but they have pretty heavily emphasized the first 4, just for what it's worth. So the big update today is this advisory board work that we've been doing. And this is, again, stuff that you've seen before. But we are required to have an advisory board for this federal grant, which is kind of new. We haven't done that in the past. And there are minimum requirements for the board. It must include law enforcement, the community, courts, prosecution, behavioral health providers, victim services, and legal counsel, which was defined as an attorney. So really could be from anywhere.
They're a dime a dozen.
Just go find one. So the other thing about this is the advisory board gets to shape the state's priorities. So if they decide we'd like to pursue 2 of the 4 programs that are prioritized, none of the 4, they get to do that. But BJA is the final decision maker as to whether the awards or the applications advanced by the advisory board are awarded, which again is a little bit different. So the last time I talked to you about this, we presented to you sort of an idea of a framework for what a board might look like. And we added a few folks based on your representation, or we added a few representatives based on your input. So this is sort of a progress report. The checks are folks that we've had more or less confirmed, and you'll see that they're largely from institutions like courts. We have our state sheriff association nomination. And what you'll see is the sort of asterisk is a pending. One of the things that's been interesting about this progress is that for the non-institutional nominations, we haven't asked folks to fill out like a specific application that says, how do you qualify as a gun violence survivor? We have said, this is an opportunity to do this kind of work. What are the things about you and your life experience that make you someone who might be helpful or have good thoughts to bring to the table. So we have a number of people who meet a lot of different things, which is really cool, I think. So a lot of folks cover more than one area of representation. Oh, wait, no. So far, this is where the folks are sort of distributed. I expect this to expand more after we keep working on this, but I just wanted you to see a little bit of where the geographic representation has fallen so far. Once we have, again, more folks pending. What we're doing is going through the folks that have nominated themselves or been nominated by other people, giving them a call and just seeing, trying to garner more information about, what their thoughts are, more parts of their backgrounds, and to see who would best fit this slate of people we're looking for. This slide here, sorry, Casey, feels so rude just in your face. So this is, I want to first say this is probably underrepresented, but I wanted to show you just a little bit of a scatter of where the expressed experience is coming from. And it is caveat that it is expressed because we didn't ask people to prove, how many of you are gun owners? How many of you are veterans? This was based on when we asked them if they were interested or if they expressed interest. Here's what we kind of pulled from how they describe themselves. A lot of folks have a professional role that makes them, something that they deal with gun violence, be it via law enforcement or they doing behavioral health work. About half of people so far have had some sort of community volunteering experience. About a third reported they were parents. I expect that in reality that's probably higher. But again, we didn't ask them that question. About 1 in 5 have reported that they are firearms owners. Same for gun violence reduction work. A few folks said that they had grant experience, which is always helpful just to kind of know how processes like this work. About 1 in 5 expressed that they had some sort of gun violence survivorship in their past or in their families. And then 7% reported that they were a veteran. So again, once we get to know folks a little bit more, I expect this to shift a bit, but this is generally where people are falling so far. And again, this is overlapping people. This isn't, people have more than one square that represents them. The other thing I wanted to point out was this is not the only grant in Oregon that's working on gun violence reduction. We actually have two. One is another federal opportunity. One is a state grant. There's $5 million that came out of the 2021 session it's operated by DAS through a local organization and then OHA. And the OHA's RFP is just going out now. But it's $5 million in general fund for hospital-based programs, professional pathways, again, for hospital-based violence intervention peers, so kind of beefing up that workforce, and then a community violence award for addressing and supporting protective factors to try to prevent things on the front end. And then the Department of Justice, Oregon Department of Justice, is operating a very broad, open ARPA fund grant with $15 million available for CVOs to really kind of present any gun violence proposal reduction or gun violence reduction program proposal that they find useful in their community. So it's very broad. We're kind of keeping tabs on them to see who they get. Again, the idea being that's $20 million that is already out there. Let's see where it goes. And then so we can use kind of this relatively small amount of money to fill gaps. At least that's the idea. And I would add that, of course, that's not up to me. It's up to the advisory board. But I do think folks have been interested in leveraging what we already have going on in the best way possible. So next steps, like I said, we have a grant orientation next week with the feds. We'll continue this board recruitment. The legislative appointments we expect sometime in mid-May. That's cross our fingers for that. Again, ongoing coordination with existing initiatives, and then planning these meetings once we get our board put together. Kind of where will we start? How will we orient them to the project? That sort of thing. So it was a little bit fast and furious. If you have any questions, we're right here. So.
Any questions for Bridget about her skip update, which we didn't skip? Yes. Commissioner Lewis.
Solomon.
Commissioner Lewis Solomon.
Bridget, what are you doing in terms of recruitment outreach? How are you getting information out to people?
We have two, Commissioner Solomon, Vice Chair Bevette, Commissioner Solomon. We have kind of at least two paths. One is we created essentially an online self-nomination form that we have shared with, I mean, it has been sent to hundreds of people. So we've gotten a few, it's not, it hasn't been hugely used, but there is this public-facing form that anyone can use to nominate themselves. And then we've done also just based on the membership, sort of the roster of folks going to organizations, going to tribal governments and saying there's this opportunity, please let folks know if you have questions. So it's a little bit of making a public portal available and then just doing direct outreach to groups we know are doing either this kind of work or have been working on grants like this. And then we've also been reaching out to just institutions. I use the phrase institution just to kind of separate from communities like Oregon State Sheriffs, the courts, DOJ, the Prosecutors Association, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And when are you trying to stand the committee up by?
As soon as possible is really what we're looking for. Honestly, I think we'd hoped we've had a few more confirmations by now, but I do think session has kind of drawn everyone's attention to doing other things. But really, I think we're about halfway there. And I know Ryan and I have split this, so I don't know, Ryan, if you've been either sort of.
Well, I just make this statement to say if you have interest or want to make nominations for outreach for us to do, we certainly welcome that as well. If there's suggestions, I know that we've received some of that feedback from some of you. In terms of just where to share this kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I just noticed in the one of the slides you shared that there were a number of positions that, you know, you're still seeking appointment or nominations for. So it seems like there's still some work to do to get people to apply.
Definitely. We do have for like tribal governments, we have reached out to you know, all 9 federally recognized tribal governments. We've reached out to OHA's tribal affairs group. We've also started to reach out to tribal nonprofits or youth organizations. So it is sort of like a multifaceted way of trying to get folks to represent or to nominate themselves to be represented. The other thing that's a little bit hard is for community-based violence prevention, people don't all view that term universally as like the same thing. So trying to be very broad about who we're reaching out to, because you know, some folks view community-based violence prevention as law enforcement. Some folks view that as this very sort of niche, peer-led, yeah, I'd say call it like peer-led one-on-one intervention. So just trying to, it's been a little bit of a learning experience for CJC as well, because I mean, I don't think we as an organization have done anything really gun violence prevention related as a project before. So we are building some new relationships and finding new folks to partner with. So.
Great. And last question. So I get that this is different than traditional burn grant funding, and the CJC's role, it sounds like, is going to be a little different. So help me understand what the CJC's role will be. I mean, will this committee operate independently, make the recommendations, and then that goes to BJA, and the CJC doesn't have really any oversight function? Or is there some sort of oversight function that the CJC has over the committee?
Vice Chair Bevette, Commissioner Solomon, it is a little bit different insofar as the decision-making on this at the state level is the purview of the advisory board. I think that at least agency staff will be administering, we'll certainly be facilitating that advisory board. We'll keep the commission updated on all of the, you know, sort of what's what and the direction things are going. But the solicitation from the feds does make it pretty clear that unlike previous versions of Burn JAG, where the commission would be the deciding factor, they do want it put into this advisory board. And then even the advisory board isn't really the final decision maker. It then goes back up to BJA, and they decide whether they agree with the programs that the advisory board has referred to them as being eligible. So, but it has been our plan to at least, I mean, I hope that doesn't sound like we're trying to exclude the input of the commission, but strictly speaking, it is a little bit of a, don't see a direct decision-making role like there have been in other federal grants.
So really, the decision for this commission is the appointment of the advisory board.
I
Is that
think,
pretty much our involvement, direct involvement?
Vice Chair Babette, so that the framework or the framing up of who would be represented on the board is, yeah, that is the input we are seeking.
Any other questions from commissioners or staff? Skip, go ahead.
So with regard to specifically the, and forgive me, firearms victim survivor, I can't remember what the, has that specifically been defined yet? Because I could see some very vast viewpoints and perspectives with regard to survivors of gun violence. I was just curious, and if it's easier just to refer me to somewhere, I'm happy to look it up later.
Vice Chair Babette, Commissioner Beach, for this grant, we did not narrow what that meant in any respect. And in fact, the folks that have included that as part of their sort of self-expressed narrative have family members who have committed suicide, have had family members who have been shot, those kinds of things. And then other versions of what gun violence survivorship looks like. So I don't think I could give you a perfect definition of what that means. And we have intentionally left that open just because there are, I mean, unfortunately, so many ways to survive gun violence. I mean, there are communities that describe themselves as gun violence survivors, even if their sort of personal story is not one of being directly involved. So yeah, a long way of saying it's pretty broad for, I think, good reasons.
It's great to hear.
And I agree with Commissioner Beach's sentiment, but as I recall last time, or maybe it was 2 times ago, Commissioner Freeman proposed a slot, and I think I proposed this slot. And at least my idea was that we probably ought to have a family member of someone who's been murdered on this advisory board. And I understand suicide is a huge major deal too, but I think the purpose of this grant is really to look at violence, not necessarily suicide. But correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure, you know.
Vice Chair, but that the solicitation doesn't negate suicide as the focus of gun violence reduction. But I do think based on the 4 priorities espoused by the BJA, you don't see, I mean, it is burn JAG, so we know it's sort of coming from a law enforcement focused grant program. I guess I would say, I don't see anything that would require the person qualify as a gun violence survivor be crime-based. And I will say that we are honestly just letting folks kind of describe that for themselves at this point. And I mean, we certainly take that input as part of when we're trying to decide, you know, how we're best situating the 21 or so people who will make up this, that those perspectives are there. But yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to say that suicide couldn't be a state's focus. I think you would have to make a really good case for it, though.
Got it. Okay. Thank you so much. Any other questions, comments? Thank you very much, Bridget.
Thank you.
Let's see, the next item on our agenda is JRI Racial Disparity Tool Sentencing. Looks like Ian's covering this one.
I do. So, good afternoon, Commissioners. Ian Davidson, I'm the Justice Reinvestment Program Manager, and as Vice Chair Bovett just mentioned, I'm going to be previewing a new tool that lives on our Justice Reinvestment dashboard. We're calling it the Racial Disparity Tool for Sentencing. So before we before I preview the actual tool or show you images of the tool, I think it might be helpful to talk about the why and the what of the racial disparity tool. So first, for the why, the Justice Reinvestment Grant Review Committee for the past several years, they've been thinking how best to assess and address disparities within the systems funded by the Justice Reinvestment Program. And they've indicated that they're committed to better understanding those disparities, and then they wanted a tool to help them better understand the scope and the scale of those disparities in the Justice Reinvestment programs that are funded. 2 years ago, we unveiled a race, ethnicity, and gender tool, which we included as part of our grant application. And it had some weaknesses, and we have learned from those. One of the main weaknesses of it was that it was a tool that was really well suited for larger counties because it relied heavily on percentages. And so for smaller counties with smaller populations, the percentages were not particularly helpful for them. And so we went back to the drawing board. And so we've spent the better part of 2 years now rethinking how we present this information. And so this tool is a result of not only our internal thinking, but also external conversations with key stakeholders. We also needed this tool to be a tool that was useful not only to the grant review committee when they take a long, hard look at applications every couple of years, but it needed to be something that was useful to the grantees themselves. And so with that in mind, that influenced our decision-making and building this tool. And so one other piece that I think is important to note is that this tool reflects the lack of data of other historically underserved groups. And so it is a reality that we face that we are limited by the data that we have. And so we have pretty good race, ethnicity, and gender data available to us. And so that is what we present in the tool. We don't have good centralized statewide data on other historically underserved populations. And so this, of course, doesn't mean that an individual county couldn't take on that kind of data project on their own and present that for their own county and to use that in their own decision making. It just means that we as the state agency do not have comprehensive enough data to be able to present on that authoritatively in a way that would be useful to all of those counties. So next, I'll talk through the what of the tool, and I think it's helpful to think of it in two terms. One is what is and what it isn't. And so first, for what it is focused on probation use for nonviolent crimes. So it has a pretty narrow focus. It's just those nonviolent crimes. So justice reinvestment focused, and then we're looking at it. The decision point is probation sentences. It is not an all-encompassing criminal justice racial disparity tool. And so this, for example, doesn't take a look at arrests, doesn't take a look at pretrial incarceration, speediness of trial, or any other parts of the criminal justice system. So this has a pretty narrow focus, both in the kinds of demographics and also where along the criminal legal system the decision points are. This is, however, a resource to inform program grant development. And so, and I mentioned this before, but we've designed this tool in a way to where it's beneficial to the counties themselves and those key decision makers as they develop or refine their justice reinvestment program applications. This tool, however, is not designed to determine grant funding. I'll probably end up saying this phrase a couple times through my presentation, but this tool is informative, not determinative. And however, this tool does inform grant program review. This is, as I mentioned at the top, a tool that the grant review committee specifically requested. And so they will use this tool along with other dashboards that we have provided to them, along with the applications, the context that the counties provide to create a holistic decision or recommendations that will ultimately go to you all. And this is not a tool for examining gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, religious affiliation, or other of those demographic categorizations. It's, again, a fairly narrowly focused tool. So I think it's helpful to define terms here. When we talk parity parity means numerical equivalence or similarity. And so 5 equals 5. For disparity, it's the opposite. It's numerical difference or a lack of similarity. So 5 does not equal 6. And so as I said before, this tool is informative, not determinative. The tool itself is not making a judgment call that 5 should be 6. It's simply noting the difference. And so it's not a qualitative statement. It's not a qualitative statement. It's simply a quantitative reflection of the data that we have. And so maybe a succinct way to say it is that this tool doesn't make decisions. The decision makers make the decisions. So we, as a Justice Reinvestment Grant Review Committee, met recently, talked about this tool, got feedback, incorporated some of that feedback, and then talked through how this tool would be used. And I think it might be helpful to talk through that with you all. So in the next slide, you will see, or the next few slides, you will see a screenshot of our tool, and that is what will be presented to the Grant Review Committee. So the tool itself is interactive. There's a lot of tool tips, a lot of data. What they will see is just a static image. Now, if they wish to see additional information and time allows, of course, we're going to go live to the tool, look through that. But what we are prepared to do during the meeting, given the time constraints and the number of applications, is just to prevent a static image for each county. As we have talked with them in the past, and as I'm sure we will remind them, magnitude and trend are both important when considering data, whether that is prison usage data or racial disparity data. And then along with other tools that we use, there is no kind of cutoff where, like, if you pass this threshold, there must be X intervention or Y action must be taken. Again, this tool is informative, not determinative. And then the way we have structured our application process this year is that we are front loading our narrative questions, and we are moving a lot of our questions to drop down and checkbox. So not only will it be easier for counties to apply, but I think it'll be easier for the Grant Review Committee to get a handle on what these applications are and aren't. One of the benefits of moving that process forward is that then the Grant Review Committee has an opportunity to provide feedback, whether that's questions or concerns that they have, or just clarification that they're seeking for the applications themselves. And so if there is something, whether that's in the prison usage data or the racial disparity data that they would like to seek further clarification on, they can get that clarification early in the process, well in advance of when any kind of decisions are being made. Oh, and I'll note that we have a specific question that prompts counties to refer to the racial disparity tool, where they can provide additional contextual information that may not be obvious in the tool. So here's the tool itself. So far we haven't, no data is presented, but I thought it would be helpful to orient you to it. So here on the left is the probation racial disparity tool, and then on the right is the prison and jail admissions. So yeah, that laser, you actually can't see that. And for sure, the people online can't see that. So, so the one on the left tells you if you have a disparity between sentencing of the white population with any of the 4 minority populations, which you see on the top right. And then the plot on the right allows the user to focus on what crime types might be contributing to that disparity, so that they can perhaps change how they're allocating their grant resources as a result. And so for the tool, what we are showing is the gap between the rate at which the white population are sentenced to probation and the rate at which a minority group is sentenced to probation. The gap is represented by a number of the additional people. So on your left here, you see that the y-axis. So let's see. So a value of 0 means that there is perfect parity. There's no more or no fewer minority individuals would be expected to receive a probation sentence. If the sentence were in, now the more positive the value, the more people would have had to have received a different sentence if there were to be parity. So it's important to keep in mind that this tool is not designed to identify individual cases like, oh, X, Y, and Z case should have been decided differently. That's not what this tool is used for. This is just to give counties a resource as they consider how to allocate their allocate their resources. For the crime type on the right plot, we'll see a number of prison or jail admissions for each crime sentence for the time period and race indicated. And so if there's a disparity of a certain demographic population, and then we see that the vast majority of those are in property crime types, that might help counties direct how they spend their resources. Oops. So here is the statewide group now with some data applied over top of it. So this is the actual data that is live or will be live shortly. And so I'd like to maybe just orient you a little to what we see on the statewide level. And so you can see that there's a curve for each minority race, each of those colors corresponding to the colors in the top right. And when a grantee goes to this, of course, this data will be live and interactive so they can hover over things. And there will be additional tools throughout that page. So if we were to evaluate this data here as if it were a county, we might see a trend of positive values for Black and Native men for the past 10 years. So it's above that 0 line there. This suggests a long-term trend of disparate rates of probation sentences that could be driven by a number of factors. If we were to review this as if it were a county, we might look at their application to see if they were introducing culturally responsive services or if they've considered what might be driving this disparity. And so next we'll show 2 counties. Because of where we are, we'll show Marion and Polk County. We'll take them one by one. So here's Polk County. A couple things to note about Polk County, and this is the kind of thing that we would point out to the grant review committee, is that with Polk County, it's really important, and with all counties for that matter, it's really important to look at trends, not a single data point for a single year. And so while in 2022, if you look at the light blue line, there is a higher rate of Latinx men for 2022. Overall, Polk County shows neither a trend nor large magnitudes of disparity in any racial group for men. So their justice reinvestment application might indicate, hey, we believe that one of the factors driving this is X program. We ask that you continue to fund that. Or maybe there might be other drivers not funded by the Justice Reinvestment Grant Program. So for Marion County, hopping over the river, you see that there's a lot of high magnitude variability for Latinx men, which is that light blue color. But overall, it doesn't show a trend of disparity for Latinx men. However, that dark blue curve for Black men is consistently above 0. It's in positive numbers until 2020. And this means that to be at parity, they would need, on average, during those years, about 5 additional probation sentences for Black men each year. And so this grantee might choose to address this disparity by requesting resources for a culturally specific program for Black men. They might choose to consider what are those drivers. What some counties have done is that they have put together advisory bodies or focus groups to better understand what processes or policies they have that may be driving some of those things. So it's an opportunity for reflection.
Ian, so when you're determining kind of the racial makeup well, I don't know if this is statewide or by county, are you looking at the county's demographic data? So if you're looking in Marion County, are you looking at the percentage of African Americans in Marion County? Or are you using statewide data that you're comparing to for baseline?
Yes, so we are looking at, this does not take into account the population makeup of each county. This is only looking at sentences, so total sentences, and then comparing the probation sentences versus individual sentenced to prison or local control.
So as I understand, it has nothing to do with population at all.
Right.
Okay.
Essentially, your data set is those that are being sentenced.
Yeah, so they're in the system. The decision, one of the key decision points for the Justice Reinvestment Grant Program is how are they being sentenced? And so what we're looking at and what this data reflects is the percentage or the rate of individuals being sentenced to probation as opposed to prison versus, or local control. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And why are we only looking at probation, nonviolent offenses and not PPS or other types of crimes?
One of the reasons is that this is kind of our first foray into this. We wanted to make sure that this tool worked in the way that we wanted it to. And so we have incorporated a lot of feedback that we've received, especially over the last 6 months. And we plan on not only refining this tool, but in all likelihood, releasing additional tools that look beyond just this narrow focus. And so this is the racial disparity tool for sentencing. I think it is very likely that there will be racial disparity tools for other parts within the system. And because this is tied to the Justice Reinvestment Grant Program, we're looking at that nonviolent population initially.
Any other questions?
Jessica.
Oh, go ahead.
Two just really brief clarifying questions. When you use the term or definition probation, I'm assuming you're referring to formal probation versus bench probation?
Yes. Yeah, I'm getting the nod from Kelly, so that means yes.
And then one other clarifying question. So I'm assuming these are referring to the entire population placed on probation versus presumptive prison non-person offenses that could have gone to prison but then were placed on probation?
Downward
That's a
departures.
good question.
This, I'll want to confirm that, but I believe that that population is included. Yeah.
So it would be all probation, not just those that were out of prison.
I can jump in and clarify a little bit. Kelly Officer, Research Director at CJC. This is all coming from the Department of Corrections data. So if somebody does have that presumptive prison sentence and then receives the downward departure to probation, they will be included in this. We would love it if we could really single those out as opposed to those that were presumptive probation. And we've struggled with that on a statewide level. And so this is, as you all just said, this is really looking at, we're starting at conviction and then looking at probation versus prison and local control.
That's helpful, thank you.
Other questions?
One other, forgive me.
Keep going.
When you refer to grant review committee, just to clarify, is this just the Justice Reinvestment Grant Committee, Review Committee, not specialty courts per se? And I say that just because, again, specialty courts generally are dealing with probationers, so.
Yeah, for right
And a
now,
lot of our diverted population from prison as well, so.
yeah, for right now, the only grant review committee that will be using this tool is Justice Reinvestment. That may change, especially as additional tools may be added.
Continue on, unless there's any other questions.
I just want to convey here at this point that we have been going on a little bit of a roadshow, kind of previewing this new tool, and each presentation that we've made it abundantly clear, and we're conveying this to counties, that if they have questions or if they would like to do a deep dive with their county, maybe with their local public safety coordinating council, we're happy to do that. And so we're trying to make ourselves as available as possible to the counties, as this is a new tool for them with this grant cycle. And so to conclude my presentation, I just wanted to kind of reiterate how this tool will be used for the grant review committee. So what you just saw is what they will see. And there, as I mentioned before, there is a question that is specific to this tool that counties will have an opportunity to react to and talk about. And then there are additional questions that might shed additional light. So I'll use Washington County as an example. They recently instituted a culturally specific program funded by the Justice Reinvestment Program for Black men. And so since our application is focused on programs, they'll indicate, hey, our target population are Black men. And then from there, if the grant review committee notices something on the tool that maybe piques their interest, right then and there, it's easy to see in the application, okay, Washington County has implemented the HEAT program. And so there are some, I guess, quicker ways for the grant review committee to see what the county is doing. And then again, both trend and magnitude are really important, and we are not implementing any kind of cutoff. Again, the tool is informative, not determinative. And with that, that concludes my presentation.
Any other questions, comments? Commissioner Beach. This is
Forgive
up
me.
her alley. So
This
she's
is
got a
up
lot
my
of
alley.
questions.
Kind of like this stuff. I guess this is more of a comment because I know this is probably your first purview with this, and you indicated that there's plans to probably extend on this, but I know the Department of Corrections has been collecting and actually working with community corrections directors on looking at disparity with regard to probation sanctioning. And I just, as a comment, that might be a great second development of this type of tool for the CJC. That would be helpful.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And in a similar vein, Senate Bill 1510 asked CJC to evaluate some things. And so those are definitely in our conversations. And I don't know, and Kelly can maybe speak to this, what DOC plans to tackle on their own versus what we'll do, but yeah.
Go ahead.
I'll jump in. I'll just say, yeah, I think we're in the process of figuring that out. Senate Bill 1510 does tell us CJC to produce an annual report that has sanction and revocation data by race ethnicity, which DOC already has that data. We can produce that report, no problem. But when you just produce that summary measure and just say, okay, here's how many sanctions there were by race ethnicity, it's not going to have a whole lot of context. I'm not sure it'll be real actionable for community corrections to use. And so thinking about moving more towards this direction or towards a more complex analysis to kind of provide some context for that, right? Why was the person sanctioned? How many sanctions did they receive? What was their risk level? Once a person is being supervised in the community, we do have a lot more information about what is happening there. So we're working on figuring out the path forward to meet the requirements of the bill, but also to have something that's actionable that can kind of help folks as they develop those programs.
I appreciate that effort because it doesn't sound like per the bill it's going to be much different than the data that DOC is already providing on the sanctioning. And I'm just wondering, to Commissioner Beach's earlier point, like how do we tie this to JRI funding around programs that are specifically attempting to reduce sanction use or, alternatives to in-custody sanctions.
Lots of questions. We have lots of questions. And good luck with all the data. Thank you so much. All right, next on our agenda, thank you, Ian, by the way. Next on our agenda is grant timelines, and I guess Ryan's going to take that one.
Thank you. For the record, Ryan Keck, Programs Director. I just wanted to go over, spend a little time talking about some of the adjustments and improvements we're making to our grant application processes, as well as some timelines as we, believe it or not, are beginning that 23-25 grant cycle already. And so, like Ian's mentioned, kind of in the development of both that tool and some of the application questions following through, we've spent the better part of this existing grant cycle really trying to understand and do outreach with grantees and partners about where we can make improvements to the grant programs that we facilitate. There's been lots of changes over the years. Sometimes per cycle, there's a difference or a variance to how that grant program is conducted or the award process is facilitated. And so we've done a lot of that outreach to find out what's been working well, maybe what could work better. And so what you see here is just a very short list. If we look at the totality of the grant making process, a couple of consistent pieces of feedback we got was consistency, as well as transparency and efficiency. And so we've been working to kind of bring those interests to light as we make improvements. Also, this importance of asking the right questions. Over time, the applications have had more and more questions asked of grantees, and only left more questions to be answered by, say, staff and or the review committee before making decisions, or the commissioners yourselves. And so looking to find how to find the right questions to ask to provide the information for review and decision making. And then finally, just collectively, the value of that outreach and that engagement. I think like every industry across the globe, the pandemic we all took a huge hit as a result of the pandemic, but recognize that as we start communicating more and engaging more and building relationships back, The value of that, the feedback and the two-way communication is paramount. And so with that, there's a couple of significant things we've done in two of the areas, or two programs that are, like I said, opening or open at this point now. Those also being our larger in relation to grantee number, special court and justice reinvestment. So I just want to talk through some of those improvements with you. So starting with specialty courts, here's just a kind of a short abbreviation of what we've done to improve that process. For one, I should back up to say that all grant programs now are going to utilize, as they have in the past, the same, it used to be called a grant management handbook. Now we're calling it a grant administration guide. But we've reviewed that document and filled it with a lot of the structured, kind of consistent procedures of every grant program. So there's just one go-to resource for any and all grantees around how the process works in a general sense. It also has a lot of the guidelines and regulations as it relates to being a grantee. What that allowed us to do is create streamlined and efficient solicitations that, in terms of content, they're usually 2 or 3 pages long as opposed to 7 or 8 pages long. There are additional pages as appendices that have a preview of questions or like what the budget sheet will look like without having to log into the grant administration system. But it is, again, an effort to be both efficient as well as consistent, being that they're the same. And then hopefully then all these materials start to look the same as well within each program. So as I look at some of the commissioners, right, as counties, you see the same thing, the same product in a lot of ways from the Justice Commission, with just variances for what the focus or the goal is of that grant funding. So back to special court specifically. There were a lot of questions in that application. I think those who are familiar with it know. And so we took a real significant effort to reduce that down as much as possible. So there's a much shorter list of questions in the application, and they're focused specifically on adherence to the Oregon Special Court standards. So a lot of the other information that we need, or as a part of the evaluation, we look for other means to get it so that grantees or applicants are able to kind of zero in on the most critical pieces of information that we need from them. So as you look at some of these other bullets, we created document uploads. We don't need a narrative, or we don't want to burden the grantees with the narrative of explaining the coverage of care in their county, or some of the policy related or participant related requirements. They can upload the policy manual, their participant manual, upload their MOUs, a number of different documents, and then staff have that as well as a review committee to review, as opposed to asking grantees to put it all in narrative form. We also partner with the the Judicial Department to acquire data and other pieces of information through SCMS, the standardized management system that's in place, rather than, again, asking for that information to be regurgitated or typed in by a grantee or applicant. Kind of hits on both efficiency and consistency is that, as you may remember in justice reinvestment a few cycles back, or a cycle back, we introduced a kind of split process, a 2-phase application process. We're doing that with specialty courts as well. So again, some consistency between programs, but the real key is that between this preliminary application and then a final application, there's an opportunity for the review committee to take a look at, and in specialty courts case, make determinations about adherence to standards and provide feedback then to the grantees to know where and how to focus their requests, as opposed to just asking for what they feel they need. And in often cases, it's a lot, but giving them feedback to allow them to zero in on where an objective body of this commission has determined that maybe the need, it should be focused as it relates to established standards for best practice. And so that's new. It does stretch out the process a little bit, but for good reason and good cause. This program's already open, so the solicitation opened up at the beginning of the month. We've got a due date, as you can see here, in middle of April. And then just by way of dates, you can see what I've kind of just described, that the GRC would get together and talk and make determinations not about funding, but specifically just about performance as it relates to the special court standards at this point in time. The feedback goes back to the grantees or the applicants, who then will be asked to provide their budget, any adjustments, there's an opportunity for them to speak to any changes or adjustments, but then provide a funding budget or projection for the grant review committee to again convene and review to make recommendations to you all for decision making in July. I'll point out, it's not on the slide, that what will be different with this process as well, again, speaks to consistency and also efficiency, is that specialty court has traditionally, or at least for the last biennium or so, been a reimbursement grant. So the money is not given out to the county until the quarterly report is turned in. Like Justice Reinvestment, this biennium, we're going to switch to an advanced payment process. So they will receive a cut of, or a distribution of money upon award, and then we'll still do regular tracking. We'll still monitor expenditures and make adjustments as we go throughout that grant cycle, but it'll allow the grantees to have disbursements up front, and then we can adjust as we go. It will then create, again, consistency with JRI, so at the county level, hopefully that provides some benefit and value. And it'll also then extend the grant period a little bit further. So it'll go into a process that instead of 8 quarters locked into the biennium, it'll allow for not necessarily this time, but a little bit more flexibility in 23, 25, 27 for you all and the grant review committee to have some time to review and evaluate applications on a little bit more of a stretched guideline, because money will be distributed and overlapping in what will be called a quarter 9, quarter 10, like Justice Reinvestment.
Can I pause you? Because I do have some questions. Late May, adherence to standards.
Yeah.
What does standards mean?
Yeah, great question, Vice Chair Bovet. So the state has established via CJC in partnership with OJD, the Oregon Specialty Court Standards, which are built off of a national model of best practices for specialty courts, primarily.
I understand those, so that's what those are.
So that's what those are, yes.
Okay,
exactly.
so then I'm confused then about, so the feedback to grantees from the grant review committee consists of what? Can you hit me with that again?
Well, this will be our first try at seeing what it is, but how it's designed is to say, we've asked kind of some deliberate, I think 13 questions specific to each of the 10 key components in those standards, as well as then pulling this data and other information to look at. So the grant review committee's goal would be to determine whether or not they feel what's presented to them by the court, both in data and in application, is meeting each of those standards.
And so the feedback will be based upon the standards.
Exactly. So in the event that there's not, the GRC, I might envision, provides feedback to say, we'd really like to see this grant applicant focus in on standard number X, and maybe in this way, or explore this approach in order to gain compliance or adherence.
And that makes perfect sense to me. My concern is what happened to JRI. My concern is that policy decisions should be made at this commission.
Okay.
Policy decisions should not be made at a grant review committee level or by staff. When we're talking about true policies, we shouldn't be driving policy, I think, through mechanisms that are designed to steer grantees in one particular direction when the grantee may logically want to go a different direction, all within the standards, if you follow me. And so I still have heartburn over JRI. And I think that was a mistaken bill to pass. And I don't want to see us slip our other programs into that mistake. And that's just my personal opinion.
If I can add, Vice Chair, I think to your point, there is still flexibility in what can be applied for. We are trying to transition towards, again, allowing the courts to determine what they feel is best for them, but with a feedback process in place to kind of highlight the standards in the
I think we should be the evidence-based people, the evidence-informed people. I don't think we should be forcing people to choose one policy that's evidence-based over another policy that's evidence-based. I don't think that is the role of us, but that's just one person. Anyways, thank you for answering my questions.
And I guess maybe this is more of a comment than a question. I guess my only concern with the adherence to the standards, although it's certainly pie in the sky, and I think it's what all specialty courts should attempt to achieve. I guess my concern is the grant review committee going to look at a submission of a county that is potentially has more resources and are meeting those standards? Are they going to be more favorable towards that county's submission versus maybe a smaller rural less resources who may not have those standards yet in place, but maybe those grant funds would help them achieve that. Am I getting across my?
That's another way of asking the same question I was asking.
I think it was.
Yeah, so Vice Chair Bovet and Commissioner Beach, we do again intend to look at kind of at an individual level. So that would include all dynamics of the individual court and what's being asked, what barriers or other presentations are included in their application. As this body knows very well, one of the challenges will be is finding some kind of degree of consistency in approach made with limited funding stream. And so that's why we've been taking a look at both standards as one measure of kind of application, but also to include participation counts and some of those other factors that are discussed. So I maybe was remiss in not including some of those other pieces that will factor in to kind of the decision-making or the recommendations that are provided.
Great. Sorry, didn't mean to we
No
just
worries.
interrupted.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect timing. So I'm going to switch to justice reinvestment at this point then, unless there are other questions here similarly. So justice reinvestment has also spent some time looking at and how ways in which to improve, very similar feedback, so similar adjustments. Again, number of questions being reduced and really focused in at the program level, as Ian mentioned before. So asking questions about the programs being run within that county specifically. So as some of us saw this morning, Marion County has a number of JRI funded programs. So asking the questions not about collectively the county and their JRI programming, but specifically each program and asking around what is their target, who is being served, how in what ways does it contribute to the goals of justice reinvestment, et cetera. So that was one of the primary shifts. And then also similarly by reducing the number of narrative entries and instead of switching to where possible check boxes or drop down choices, again, to alleviate some of the burden on the applicants who are filling these out, and particularly in relation to multiple maybe programs, just trying to streamline and make efficiencies in this application process. This program already had a kind of split preliminary application and a final application with that feedback in between. But what we tried to do is shift the bulk of the questions to the front end, so in that preliminary application, so that the feedback can be tailored at that time to what is presented on the programs. And then the time in between that can be utilized by the counties and the applicants to incorporate that feedback, as well as focusing on the other arms or fingers or legs, whichever way we want to describe the Justice Reinvestment Program. So by putting kind of upfront the effort towards the formula grant and kind of the lift that takes, opening up time then through the summer for the other pieces of the Justice Reinvestment Program. So I do have a little drawing here courtesy of Ian to kind of help show that. As we know, Justice Reinvestment, it's a little bit complicated with its two branched grants, the formula grant and the competitive grant, and kind of the ancillary pieces. But by putting the emphasis on the front end, we're asking that preliminary application really just focus on the formula grant, and that would be due here in May. Review committee would convene, provide feedback. The other pieces all then fold into and are part of that final submission. So the final application, which will be due in September, does include any changes in the budget piece to the formula grant. But that's also then the time at which victim service providers or requests related would be due. Those counties that choose to put together an evaluation plan for the 3% funding, and then that kind of separate competitive grant focused in on downward departure diversion programs would be included in that second due date in September. Commissioner Beach?
Real quick clarification, the competitive grant, I'm assuming maybe that's a new term that we're used to historically as supplemental.
Correct. Yes. So Vice Chair Bovet, Commissioner Beach, we trying to kind of rebrand a little bit for sake of the, clearing up the confusion. I think many of us have experienced over the years with two supplemental rounds. So this is now the competitive grant for downward departure diversion programs. You'll hear about supplemental, hopefully, a long ways from now, when it's more applicably applied as a term.
And that's more consistent with how the feds call things too, so that makes sense.
And so just to one last clarifying, due May 25th, if a county is planning to submit for both a formula and a competitive, that initial phase is due the 25th? Or does this indicate the competitive portion is not due until that second phase?
Vice Chair Bovet, Commissioner Beach, second answer is correct. So in the preliminary application, there's a space to say yes or no, I'm interested in competitive. Same with the 3% evaluation funds. That said, in the final application, there's an opportunity to change your answer or go a different route.
Thank you.
Okay. And I think there's just one more slide with the same kind of information laid out for you in terms of the dates of the full process. So Justice Reinvestment does take a bit longer, but you all should see it as you know, hopefully in the end there in November at some date. So that concludes this presentation. I know I have the next agenda item as well.
Go ahead, Commissioner Beach.
Forgive me.
More up your alley.
More up my alley stuff. So I noted that clearly the solicitations for Justice Reinvestment specifically indicate 23, 25. And I know there was some question earlier in the session because technically GRI sunsets, and I do believe there is a bill that is proposed to extend it an additional 10 years. But I'm thinking that this is solidifying that we're going to proceed with requesting 2-year grant submissions, because I think there was some discussion about doing a 1 and a 1. So that pleases me.
And I guess we should probably say for the record, that bill is being heard right now
Oh,
in the legislature and Senate Judiciary Committee, which is the reason why Executive Director Ken Sanchagrin is not here, because he's testifying for that bill. So.
great. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
That's right.
I feel pretty comfortable about it. You know, it seems like at the CJC, we introduce these programs. They become evidence-informed, they become evidence-based, and then they become beloved at the legislature, but only after about 10 years worth of fighting. And that's what happened with drug court, special liquid JRI. I think we're now to 10 years. Has it been 10 years since we've done JRI?
2013.
10 years. I think it's now beloved. So I'm not, you know, we used to put in a lot of effort to keep that thing alive. I think it's proved itself, which is really cool. Maybe RJ will be the same in another 8 years. I don't know. We'll see. Paul probably knows more about that one.
See.
We'll see. All right, so that's all. Any other questions, comments? All right, so what do we have next on our agenda? I think you're still up with agency. Hang on a second. My screensaver went on.
What time? Oh, we're at 2.
Oh, timing?
Yeah.
We're 2 o'clock. So I think we're doing all right.
Yeah, I may make the offer. We do have a guest presentation from Sheriff Gardner from Polk County.
You want to do some adjustments, Sheriff? Do you want to go next? Since you're here? Might as well. Let's skip ahead to, now that was, sorry, my computer froze up on me. It's just life.
That was our last agenda item, but we can.
Last item that we'll come back to the staff report. So why don't we make space for the Sheriff?
Is up here? That's good.
Yeah, wherever.
I saw the table up there. I wasn't sure.
And so this is, the last agenda item would be IMMEGP update from Polk County. And we have Sheriff Mark Gardner.
Yeah. Well, thanks. We're just asked to come and kind of give an update on what we've done with our marijuana grant over the last, we started in 2021 and we're still going strong. I sent some pictures as well. Okay. Just for, because I'm a visual person. Just some quick high-level numbers on, just to give you a concept of the grant that we're dealing with and our problem. So our grant covers 2 employees, one with the sheriff's office, my sheriff's office, and one with Yamhill County. And then so they work together and we help them when they have takedown days and they help us. And so it's actually worked out quite well. Between the 2 counties, we've seized over 106,000 plants, nearly 100,000 pounds of processed marijuana, about $750,000 in cash, multiple properties and that are in different stages of forfeiture, some federal that started local but that are federal now. And really thinking about our county, it's relatively rural, and Yamhill is as well. 2021, we saw a lot of outdoor marijuana grows. We hit them really quite hard. That's where a lot of the plants came from. But then the following year, they turned all into indoor grows. This is one of the outdoor grows. There's just 50 greenhouses there. And that was our first outdoor grow that we found. There's houses all the way around that. There's a river that they were siphoning water off of that runs right behind there. Very, very typical of what you see in Southern Oregon as well.
Sheriff, those are 30 or 40 feet wide by 100 feet long each or something?
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to see in the context of it.
Roughly, and they're
They're on the ground, they're big.
They are big, yeah. And there's a couple indoor picture, not indoor, but looking underneath, yeah. It just goes all the way. It's interesting with how they've transitioned to indoor. Obviously, they can't grow as many plants, but they can grow all year round. And so we see that's what we're dealing with right now. And they're mainly organized crime. They're not just one-off type of people. They have ties to all over the U.S. And it's a significant impact for our county, just based on people don't realize how big of a deal this is, especially just for, whether it's water issues, because that is a big deal for farmers, because we have a lot of agriculture. And the indoor grows, they typically have a house, they'll have an outbuilding, big shop. They will cover every square inch of that house with plants inside and out. They'll leave enough room for a little cot. But that's about it. And typically one person comes or stays there and is left there essentially. We found one that was locked in behind a gate so he couldn't leave. So there's all these different elements that we have to deal with, from human trafficking to organized crime and money laundering, because they're turning around and they're buying these big properties for cash. And they turn around and they'll sell them to a friend or another coworker. Just to be able to change the names back and forth, so it kind of makes it harder on us. But that's what we've been able to do with the grant funds with just 2 detectives. This is a BHO lab extraction that burned down the house. We've had a couple of those in the last year and a half, and fortunately no one's been hurt. But yeah, that's really what you guys have invested in us, which we're very appreciative of, because we wouldn't be able to do it without it. So I'd be open to questions if there's any questions.
Thank you, Sheriff. I have some comments, but any questions?
I'm just curious, Sheriff. So with both the indoor and outdoor, how are you how are you finding sites? Is it based on electric usage, complaints from neighbors, aerial
Yes.
work that you're doing, all of the above?
All the above. Typically, people that are out in the rural areas, they're cognizant of what this is now, and if they see hoop houses popping up. And then we also have the ability to get in the air and look down and confirm what our suspicions are, so we don't waste our time on a legal grow, because there are some that we have in our county. So
Just by way of quick comment, since it's relevant, and I think maybe it'll help you out when you get to your update, just give a real quick update on the 3,000 task force bills. So for those of you not familiar, this entire program that we administer, the IMM-EGP, was originally formulated as a very small program as a sidebar of the passage of Measure 91. We wrote it in to legislation to essentially take a small skim, $6 million, small skim off the top of marijuana taxes each year, give it to the CJC to grant out. The idea back at the time in 2015 was to help the industry by closing down the black market. This was our efforts to shut down the black market. And then what's happened since then, of course, just before COVID, actually a couple years before COVID and then throughout COVID, is we saw large-scale drug trafficking organizations moving into Southwest Oregon, particularly Josephine and Jackson County. Multinational. What's that?
And Douglas.
Well, I'm getting to that too. Multinational DTOs, and not just from south of the border, from Eastern Europe as well. Because the reality is Oregon is a great place to grow cannabis. It's one of the best places in the world. So organized crime comes here, and they did in full force. And then they started going straight up the Willamette Valley, the Douglas and Lane and Polk and Yamhill and Washington and East as well. So the IMM EGP program was expanded by the legislature twice to give us greater granting authority to do grants of the size that are necessary to deal with this throughout Oregon. But those grant dollars are ending here soon. So much like Ken is testifying about JRI, the legislature set up a task force under House Bill 3000 and had us come up with not only fixes to statutory language to deal with some of the problems, because some of the problems that have stemmed from all of this activity is pretty significant labor trafficking. So we've got a lot of victimization going on. We've got a lot of water theft, and we've got a lot of environmental damage. So there's all of this stuff circulating around. And the House Bill 3000 task force spent about a year. We came up with 5 pieces of legislation. They're all moving forward. The one that's probably most relevant to what the sheriff's talking about is Senate Bill 766, which is sitting in Ways and Means right now. It successfully made it to Ways and Means with the full task force recommendation, which is not just baseline, but enhanced funding. So continuing the $6 million for victim services, about $40 million for the law enforcement and code enforcement pieces, $5 million for the state police, because the state police have been going all around the state helping everybody out. $750,000, this is new, for the Department of Justice for a resource prosecutor, as well as $5 million for the Water Resources Department. Some of those are baked into budget bills, some of them are in the various 3000 task force bills. So I thought I'd just give that real quick update. The legislature seems keen to continue this, and I think that's the right answer. Otherwise, we just let drug trafficking organizations take over, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So anyways, just thought I'd give you that brief update, and thank you for being here, Sheriff.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, happy.
Any other questions, comments?
One comment from Pete is another impact of this activity that hasn't been mentioned yet is the impact of this on rural property owners too. Yeah, just that, you know, some folks, maybe some less sophisticated folks, maybe people that are hard up for cash, sell or rent a small parcel of their large acreage and then find themselves with some pretty scary tenants.
Not just the scary tenants, but once we get rid of the tenants, if the sheriff executes a search warrant, they often get saddled with a cleanup.
Yeah.
The environmental mess has to be dealt with by a property owner, which is tragic in many cases, unless they knew what they were doing.
That one picture that had all those greenhouses, that little piece of property was rented for $5,000 for the season. And the property owner's like, well, it's almost kind of a useless piece of property to them at the time. And she got stuck with the cleanup. It really did. And it's cleaned up now, but it took a year. And again, right next to a river, all the chemicals and all that stuff. Big deal. So.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Sheriff.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, I guess we're back up to agency updates. Legislative update and budget. Back to you. I guess I give the legislative update for IMM.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, that one's done.
2 of them off the list already. So just by way of a quick update, really for the agency, of course, the session is still in full swing. So a number of bills that affect CJC are still in motion. Just running down the list, similar to the list I think that you all heard in February with maybe a few modifications, starting with House Bill 2320, which establishes a Juvenile Justice Commission within the Criminal Justice Commission that has been scheduled for a work session, so it made deadline of last week, and we heard, or at least have a work session on the 27th of this month. House Bill 2731, that was to continue funding for the Family Preservation project that runs out of, was ran by the YWCA out of Coffee Creek facility up north. That has already moved its way through the House and is now in Ways and Means for consideration. We did talk about, and again, Ken's absence is related to Senate Bill 344, the -1 amendment today, which would extend justice reinvestment by 10 years. That is being heard today with a work session that already scheduled for the 29th of this month. Senate Bill 524, this directs CJC to convene a council to study disqualifying convictions under the Teachers Standards and Practices Commission. That has been heard and in public hearing as well as a work session as well, and has moved or is moving to Ways and Means for furtherance.
Is that going to stay a study bill? I mean, usually that's always a big marker that they intend to stuff it with something else.
Yeah, at this point, I don't know that we know, but I think it is, like I said, it has moved. I know that there's been a fiscal request made, and we'll kind of remain to see where and what that turns out to be. Senate Bill 586, that was specific to making communications within the restorative justice program confidential, similar to what other types of mediation services and otherwise have in place. That has already passed the Senate and so is moving to the House, as is Senate Bill 597, which will continue the U-Visa program that's administered by this, or the reporting, I should say, of the U-Visa program that's been administered by us over the last biennium. That has passed Senate as well, has a hearing in the House, a public hearing on the 29th, so next week. Vice Chair Bovet already went over 766, and it is, I think, currently the -2 amendment in its progress with Ways and Means. Senate Bill 900 is a piece of I think, a 3-bill package at this point focused on organized retail theft and its prevention and or interdiction. So a public hearing was held yesterday and a work session. Well, I should say they were scheduled. I unfortunately popped off for another meeting, so I don't know if that went through or got carried over, but they were both scheduled at the same time yesterday.
I think they got carried over.
They were carried
I
over.
think people are still trying to figure out things.
Okay. So at least a part of this, because this one is new, is that within this currently under this Senate Bill 900 would be a $5 million grant program administered by the Justice Commission that would focus in on, like I said, prevention and or interdiction related to organized retail theft. So some of the public testimony from police agencies, loss prevention agencies, and other grocery retail associations highlighted what they called syndicates of individuals who are kind of staging large scale, I'd say theatrics, but in some cases they depict them as quite dangerous efforts in which to extract large amounts of merchandise and resell and otherwise. So that is now something new, something we had not anticipated that it's been added since the last time we all met. And the last one on my list is the one that I think we all know really well, which is Senate Bill 5505, that being the budget bill for the agency. That hasn't changed since our public hearing last month on Oregon's birthday, but of course it's still sitting out there. And fingers crossed as it relates to some of the programs, maybe to tie this back to a programs update. Of course, there's justice reinvestment, there's specialty courts, restorative justice. All of these kind of hinge on, of course, what that allocation looks like. So whether that, how much and to what extent we can make the decisions we kind of talked about earlier will depend on what recommendations see the light. With that, that's my update.
Any questions for Ryan? Comments? Not seeing any, thank you. Use of force preview is our next presentation. Kelly has moved down to the end of the table.
I'll get you queued up here, Kelly.
Thank you, Commissioners. I'm Kelly Officer, Research Director of the CJC, and presenting with me today is Paige.
Hi, for the record, I'm Paige Fry-Holcomb. I'm a Research Analyst with CJC.
And we have preliminary 2022 use of force data to present to you all today. Some background first before we get too far along. In 2015, yes, just ready to go. Thank you, Paige. Is it doing it? Okay, perfect. In 2015, the FBI created the National Use of Force Data Collection. And they worked with their CJIS Advisory Board and representatives from law enforcement agencies across the country to develop this national data collection program. The pilot study started in 2017, and then the national data collection started in January 1, 2019. So the FBI program has been up and running. It is voluntary for law enforcement agencies to participate in. And then in the 2021 legislative session, the Oregon legislature passed House Bill 2932. This requires Oregon law enforcement agencies to participate in the FBI's use of force program. So that requirement started January 1, 2022, and we now have the first calendar year of the use of force data, and we want to present that to you today. We're still calling it preliminary. We haven't done every single QA step we're going to do before we get that report finalized, but that's what we're working towards. And so we will be working on that report, and then there will be an annual report thereafter of the use of force data. So before we look at the data, it's very important to understand the definitions. These are all provided by the FBI. I forgot again, thank you. Oh my goodness, okay. These definitions are all provided from the FBI. So first off is a qualifying incident. There are three main parameters that get to a qualifying incident. So this is where a law enforcement officer uses force that results in a fatality, a serious bodily injury to a person, or the discharge of a firearm at or in the direction of a person. So it is those three primary events that make it so that event is reported into this data collection program. So definition of serious bodily injury is up here. Again, this is from the FBI. So this is a bodily injury that involves a substantial risk of death, unconsciousness, protracted and obvious disfigurement, or protracted loss or impairment of the function of a bodily member, organ, or mental faculty. So that's the serious bodily injury definition as defined for this data collection program. So if an officer uses force that results in an injury, but it's not a serious bodily injury, then it is not reported per this data collection program. Now many law enforcement agencies will do internal use of force data collection and reporting. They may put that together in an annual report and publicly release that. If they have a different definition than what is here, perhaps a broader definition, then their counts will look different than what we have in our report, and that's really just because of the different definition that is included within that. We have 0 reports as defined by the FBI. So each agency is required to report over the reporting period, which is a month, the affirmative 0 if they do have no events that occurred within the month to report for that. And then we'll get into pending unknown. So when the FBI created this program, they really wanted the information to be submitted to the program fairly soon after the event occurs. And so some of those details may be pending investigation. It's maybe going to take some time as that goes through to be able to report that information. So law enforcement agencies can enter pending as a way to say, hey, we don't know this yet, but we're probably going to know this eventually, and they can enter it in as pending. As opposed to unknown is that we don't know this and we don't think we're going to know this. So agencies really are expected to enter the information in fairly soon after the event occurs, and then can go back in and update the record accordingly after more information is known throughout the course of the investigation. So what we have today is the preliminary 2022 data. So if an event occurred in January, February 22, that agency has had a little more time to do the investigation and get all of that information figured out, as opposed to something that perhaps happened in November or December, we may have more pending information that can still be updated. That agency can still go back in and update that. So we received the data set from the system March 1, so just about 3 weeks ago for the 2022 data. But again, if we pull it a year from now, it may look a little different as more of that information has been updated in the system. And then finally, I would very much like to stress that this collection, analysis, and publication of this data is not evaluating whether the officer followed their department's policy or acted lawfully. That is a whole separate process for that. this report is to provide transparent state-level statistics on qualifying use of force incidents for that. And then here are, just to give you a sense of what's collected, these are all of the data elements that are defined by the FBI. And the FBI breaks it into roughly these topics of the incident, the officers, and the subject. So you can see the incident information there is, a lot of this is what you would probably expect. Date and time, location, reason for the initial contact, the total number of officers that were there, if the officers were injured, that type of information. The officer information, demographics of the officer, if they were on duty, if they were injured. And then finally, the subject information. So again, demographics of the subject, whether there was an apparent or known impairment, if the person was armed or other types of resistance used there. So we have information on the particular incident, we have information on the officers, and we have information on the subject. So we'll kind of go through each of those for you in this presentation. We've been working a lot on this, and I just want to say, you know, the FBI uses subject here to describe the person. We're going to use subject or individual. You know, as we've been talking about this, we kind of catch ourselves, right? Sometimes a person is acting unlawfully, and that is why the officer is called to the scene, and then a use of force event happens. Eventually, that person may be charged and convicted with a crime. So in that scenario, we would think of them as a defendant or a suspect. There can also be incidents where the person is not acting unlawfully, and perhaps the officer is the one who uses force unlawfully, and then we would think of that person as a victim. And so we want to be objective in the way we present this information, so we'll say subject or individual. Subject can sound dehumanizing. We don't want to be dehumanizing, but we also want to provide this objective information, and then also just remind that it's not known. In a lot of cases, these are still under investigation, and so we really don't even know yet what kind of the final determination was of that use of force event. So just a note there on presenting the information.
Kelly, quick question. How is race determined? Because I know this is a tough one.
I
Is
know.
it self-report? Is it the officer's determination?
I know. We're actually going to show you the breakdown of the race information. And so we'll maybe touch on that when we get to that information. But I will say all of the information is coming from law enforcement agencies. And so almost all law enforcement agencies have an FBI portal that they log into when we get the data from state police. So there is a process of collecting and entering that information. But yes, a lot of times this is going to be officer perceived information of the individual. Again, the agencies can go back in and update that later. But that will be a challenge with the race ethnicity information. All right, I'll turn it over to Paige for actual data. And she will remember to move the slide too.
Okay, so we're gonna start by talking a little bit about reporting compliance. So if you recall in the stop reports that are put out by the CJC, there was a three-tiered approach to onboarding agencies, and we found that was a really good way to show sort of the size of agencies within the state. So we took the same approach with reporting compliance for use of force. So there were 158 enrolled agencies for the reporting year of 2022. Agencies were broken down into three tiers based on numbers of officers employed. So we have tier 1, which consists of 14 agencies. This includes the Department of Corrections, which I don't think would be included in the stop tier 1, but since they are considered a law enforcement unit and required to report, they fall under tier 1. So all tier 1 agencies had 100% participation rates. Among this tier, there were 38 agency reports. And then tier 2 consists of agencies with 25 to 99 officers employed. There were 46 agencies within this tier, and this tier reached a 94% participation rate with 18 agency reports. And I think it maybe in my next slide, but 25 to 99 can be kind of a big difference if you're on the low end versus the high end. And so when we talk a little bit more about compliance, throughout the tiers. Specifically in reference to tier 2, I could say maybe like a lower or higher, so we get a better idea if we're looking at 25 versus 97. And so tier 3 consists of 24 or less employed officers. There were 98 agencies within this group, and this group had an 86% participation rate and 6 agency reports. So of all of the agencies that did not reach 100% participation for the reporting year, the highest amount of officers employed, I believe, was 32 officers. So for every agency that didn't reach 100%, they had 32 or less officers employed. Also, when you see this table here, it's important to note that the agency reports do not indicate distinct incidents. Multiple agencies within a tier may have been present on the scene of an event, and each agency is required to then submit their own individual report. So, for example, if you have Washington County and Oregon State Police, both having officers that participated in a use of force event, they would each need to submit a report to be compliant. Within the analysis, we're able to sort of identify those distinct incidents and account for those in the analysis. So here in the reported incidents, these are agency reports, not distinct reports.
So Paige, if I may ask a question, if you can go back to the last slide. So I'm a little confused here. So we got 38, 18, what's that, 56, 60 some odd incidents in the course of a whole year. That seems super low. Am I missing something here?
So Vice Chair Bovett, Commissioner Solomon, sorry, this is my first time to
you're
use
fine.
the, so I'm trying to make sure I remember that. So we do have to think about what's being reported. We're not auditing whether everything is being reported, and there's also not 100% compliance. So we do have some agencies that haven't reported, and we have no way of knowing whether they did have a qualifying incident occur or to confirm whether they did not have one. So I think there were at least 12 that we weren't able to confirm the presence of an incident or not.
I might just jump in too and just kind of add in. This is our first year of doing this, so if we had a couple years, we would have a sense of, hey, this is a little low. What's going on here? The agencies do have to do that affirmative 0, and so that really helps us to know, like, hey, they've reviewed things on their end, and did have to report that affirmative 0 for certain months. And then I think finally too, the definition is narrow, right? A fatality, a serious bodily injury, or pointing a firearm directly at a person. And so, you know, if an officer uses force, like say an officer uses a taser on someone, if that person has a minor injury or no injury from that, that's not reported in this. Some folks don't like that about this setup. But we are kind of following that FBI program in terms of the requirements of what is reported.
So when you talk about agency participation rate, does that mean the agency doesn't participate at all? Or does it mean they participate a little bit? I mean, you know, there's 12 months, I mean, to get on that, I mean.
Vice Chair Bovett and Commissioner Freeman, we talk a little bit more about that specifically in the next slide, but it is perfect. Yes, it is a perfect segue to the next slide if you'd like me to go ahead and move forward to that.
Please do. I'll just say for my purposes, based on how narrow the scope is, my gut check says that's within the range. But that's just my gut check. But I don't know.
Yeah, that serious physical injury standard.
It's pretty high.
It's frustratingly high for a prosecutor.
Yeah.
So that's why it seems, I think, small.
So of the 158 enrolled agencies, there was an overall participation rate of 89.7%. 137 of the agencies had 100% participation rates. All agencies that did not reach that 100% had employment of less than 32 or less. There were 5 agencies that did not reach 100%, but did have over 50% participation. So this could be, Commissioner Freeman, something that you may have been thinking of, that maybe they submitted reports all the way up until October, and then the last couple of months, they weren't able to for whatever reason. I still wanted to be able to differentiate between someone who reported for 9 months versus someone who reported, or not someone, an agency that reported for 1 month or 2 months. So there were 5 agencies that did not reach 100% but had over 50% participation. 4 of those were tier 3 agencies and 1 of them was a tier 2 agency. 4 agencies had less than 50% participation but more than 0. And 2 of those were tier 2 agencies and 2 of them were tier 3 agencies. And then finally, 12 agencies did not participate in reporting, 10 of which were tier 3 agencies and 2 were tier 2 agencies. Some of the barriers to reporting compliance could be technical difficulties, having issues accessing the portal. We had a couple of agencies that reported some problems with that where they had submitted most of the year and then couldn't get into it the last couple of months. So we were able to sort of troubleshoot by email and take their sort of report for 2 months or so. But among the 12 that didn't participate, maybe they also had it and didn't reach out. But then also capacity challenges and staffing shortages, particularly when we're looking at most of the agencies that didn't participate were those smaller agencies that had 24 or less employees. So you'll notice in the table that there are 0 reports listed along with agency and distinct reports. So I talked a little bit about this before, the difference between agency reports and distinct incidents. So you'll see in January there are 6 agency reports. So that means 6 different agencies had an officer present at an incident and submitted their report. But being able to look through the data, we're able to identify which ones are distinct incidents. So there weren't technically 6, there were technically 5 incidents, one of which had multiple agencies. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. And then you'll also see missing reports. So for example, January, there were 13 agencies that did not enter any data. So they did not do an affirmative 0 and did not report any qualifying incidents.
What's the deal with July?
I was gonna say, it's kind of an anomaly.
That's an anomaly of, I mean, it's out of whack.
It's, to speculate, I would just say it's the heat of the summer, you know.
And that's what I was thinking too, but then August, yeah, that's just weird. And it's 11 different agencies. Yeah. Huh. Wow.
So during the analysis, as I talked about the agency reports versus distinct, we were able to identify 6 different events where there were more than one agency present. There were, so as Kelly mentioned, we got our most recent data in on March 1. We did get a preliminary sort of pool at sort of early January. We're able to see a little bit, and there were some that had indicated that there was another agency present, but there was no corresponding report from that other agency. So I was able to sort of reach back out to OSP and say, you know, this is what I'm seeing. Is there any way we can remedy this? And we did see some improvement in that second round. So it seems like people are able to go back in and put in what they need to. So 6 of these incidents had more than one agency. Any questions about this one before I move forward? All right, so we have officer demographics listed in this table. There were 96 officers involved in qualifying use of force incidents. The majority of the officers involved in these reported incidents were 85% white and 94% male. 41% of the officers were 31 to 40 years old. Any questions about demographics? And the following slide is going to be about subject demographics. So again, it's important to note that all subject demographic information is recorded by law enforcement. This is not self-reported information. And then another thing to note is it's not really relevant as far as the report that we put out because we do it on more of a finalized data. But if we get a report and then someone goes in to say, okay, the perception may have been this was race, ethnicity, this was age group, and then maybe they confirm later that the person wasn't 30, they were actually 22. So that can change the numbers a little bit, but for the most part, it looks like that not specified is only 2. So that's a really good improvement from the data that we initially received. So there were 58 individuals involved in use of force incidents in 2022. So I believe there were 62 agency reports, 58 individual distinct incidents, so 58 subjects. There were no incidents reported where there were multiple subjects. The majority of subjects were white at 78% of all subjects, and 95% were male. And the majority of subjects were between 21 and 40 years of age. I have them bucketed a little bit differently. You can see that 21 to 30 has 17, which is 29%. And then right below there's 31 to 40, which is a 1-person difference. And so I think it makes sense to kind of look at that as a 21 to 40 years of age, where the majority of our of the subjects are falling into that category.
It's kind of amazing how close the officer demographics and the other demographics are.
So looking at the circumstances of contact, we're able to gain a bit of insight into what prompted the encounter between law enforcement and the subject. Some of the reasons for initial contact were routine patrol, medical or mental health assistance, or welfare checks, follow-up investigation, warrant service, traffic stop, and response to unlawful or suspicious activity. Based on the reported data that we received, 64% of encounters were initiated as a response to unlawful or suspicious activity. So once, kind of going through the portal as a person who's entering this information, you select what the contact is. And if you're selecting response to unlawful or suspicious activity, you're then prompted to enter the most serious offense related to that event. The officer can then enter up to 2 more offenses. And so of the most serious offenses, 49% were listed as person crimes, such as assault-related crimes, homicide offenses, kidnapping or abduction. 24% were property crimes, such as arson, burglary, destruction of property or vandalism, motor vehicle theft, robbery, stolen property offenses, and trespassing. And then 16% were societal crimes, such as disorderly conduct, DUI, UII, and weapon law violations. And then 11% were listed as other, but there's no real insight beyond that within the data. It's just an option of other. So unfortunately, we don't have, what goes into that bucket. So moving on to incident description. So 90% of subjects reportedly exhibited resistance to the actions of law enforcement officers. It's important to note that there can be more than one type of resistance listed for a subject. For example, a subject may have resisted detainment, escaped, and displayed a weapon. There were 31 agency reports that indicated more than one type of resistance during an incident. The most common form of resistance was failure to comply with verbal commands or other types of passive resistance. Additionally, the officer, the person entering this information would report whether the subject appeared to be or was impaired in some way. 43% of subjects were reportedly impaired during the encounters. The most common reported impairment was drug impairment, followed by mental impairment. And there were 5 subjects that were reported to exhibit more than one type of impairment. Maybe. There we go. Okay. So 80% of officers reportedly discharged their firearm during the use of force event. I think this is important to highlight because, as Kelly said earlier, there are these 3 main things we're looking for in an incident to know whether or not they qualify to be reported. One of those is if the officer discharged their weapon. So it doesn't require death or serious bodily injury to have occurred. If the officer fired their weapon, then it needs to be reported. And so some of that we'll see as we go along, just kind of coming back to that and remembering, okay, so if they fired, even if it didn't lead to death or injury, it's still reported. With that being said, force applied with firearm was the most common type of reported use of force. There were 4 instances where more than one type of force was used. 3 of those had 2 types of force: physical and electronic, projectile and firearm, and chemical and firearm. And then one of those cases had 3 types, which was projectile, physical, and canine. And then you'll see in the table that there are a couple of areas that say 0 under count. That means there were no qualifying incidents reported where explosives, baton, or blunt object force was used. However, this does not mean that there were no instances whatsoever that these types of forces were used, just none that resulted in those qualifying serious bodily injury or death or firearm discharge. Okay, and then moving on to incident outcomes. So to preface this slide, as Kelly said earlier, this is sort of the preliminary data update, and so some of the, going back to check is we're still doing for the report. So I did notice that this table is based on agency reports, not distinct incidents, but I do have that table and those numbers. It's just not on the slide. So this is based on the agency reports. However, the narrative is all based on distinct events, if that makes sense. So 7 of the 96 officers involved in use of force incidents were injured during the event. 5 sustained minor injuries, 1 suffered a gunshot wound, and 1 suffered other serious injury which required medical intervention or hospitalization. 3 subjects sustained more than 1 type of injury during the use of force event. So when officers or whoever's entering this data are selecting the types of injuries, they can choose gunshot wound, unconsciousness, other serious injury, death, none, pending, unknown. There were no unknowns or pendings. There were, I think, 3, is that what I said? 3 where there were multiple types of injuries through the agency reports. If we're looking at distinct incidents, so you would see gunshot wounds where that aligns with the type of force. That would actually be 7. There were 6 gunshot wounds from firearms rather than 7 in distinct incidents. Also with death, you'll see death from firearm at 26. The distinct number was 22. So those are the changes between agency report and distinct incidents. So the total death outcome would be 23 individuals. And then there at the end where it says total 64, the total of individuals is 58. So these distinct numbers that I just read out, 40% of distinct incidents resulted in death. 19% of subjects in distinct incidents were reported to have suffered no injury during the use of force incident. So again, that kind of can come back to discharging a firearm being the qualifier, and maybe that didn't result in serious bodily injury or death. All right. Yeah, I think I have the final wrap-up slide here. As a researcher, just kind of going through those tables, a lot of the counts are fairly low. So we're looking at injury types and demographics. We will have that information in the report, and we do have a year of data, but kind of thinking about trends or conclusions that can be used in this, just the counts are low. So we will have more data as the years progress on this project. So we'll be working on finalizing the analysis and finalizing and releasing the report. We're gonna shoot for in about a month. Mid-April to late April to release this first report. It's a legislative report, and it will meet that requirement. We'll continue to work with law enforcement agencies on use of force reporting, and also the bill creates the process in which CJC does an annual report, and there's no end date. So this becomes business as usual now, where every year we collect the calendar year of data and then work on the analysis and then release the report about mid to late April. And so this will be the first one, and then we'll have
additional years of data coming in. And so as we have multiple years, we may kind of revise how we're looking at it as we have more information. Trends over time, I think, will be helpful in the context of looking at this, and then also more information to start to kind of understand some trends a little bit more. You know, the 58 that we have here is limited in terms of understanding trends, but as it goes along, we can build upon that. And that is our plan going forward on this project.
Questions or comments?
I'm curious if a agency does not comply, is there any type of accountability or fine or what's?
Vice Chair Bobette, Commissioner Beach, that's a great question. You know, we've worked with law enforcement agencies on the stop program, so collecting traffic stop data, and there are times where we'll kind of have fits and starts, again, with some of the smaller agencies to get that information up and going. Well, and I suspect it's similar here, where it's a capacity and resource issue. And so in the report, we will list the specific agencies that didn't report. But other than that, there's not really any kind of a punishment mechanism that comes from that. I know the associations have worked really hard to get the word out and get that up and going. And I think too, if we have if 6 months from now an agency gets a hold of us and says, hey, we haven't been doing this, how do we do this? We're gonna be like, great, let's do this. Let's get you going. And so I think it is more of a collective effort as opposed to a punitive focus for that.
Well, and admittedly, I have no doubt law enforcement's trying to be transparent, but knowing the capacity and the turnover, particularly in this field, I could see that being the main reason for noncompliance. So thank you.
I just have two quick comments that go along with what Commissioner Beach said. One is I suspect that those smaller agencies have 12 months of zero, but that's just a suspicion. Two, I don't think you need any enforcement mechanism. You're going to list them in the report. OACP and OSSA are going to clamp down on their members that are on that list. Anybody who's on that list doesn't want to be on that list again. So we'll see. I suspect your non-compliance numbers will drop to zero pretty quick. But if I'm wrong, then we'll have more conversations. Anyone else?
Yeah, so to your point, Vice Chair Bobette, will the report list agencies by agency or by county? Oh, interesting.
We're going to list them out.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I thought was one data point in there that I think is fairly compelling was the one that showed the number of, or the percentage of people with mental health issues. And I think that speaks to the challenge that we have in law enforcement today in dealing with more and more people that have significant either co-occurring disorders or behavioral health issues that they're interfacing with that often wind up in very volatile situations where use of force occurs, unfortunately.
Spot on point. All right, well, thank you. I think we have another 6 minutes left. I don't know, but we have one item left. 3% research budget update from Kelly again. So you don't have to confine yourself to 6 minutes, but.
Okay, no, I think I could probably, if I can figure out how to do this, I think I can get through it.
Thank you both very much, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'll see if I can do this fairly quickly. I have an update for you today on our Justice Reinvestment 3% projects for this biennium. So just as a reminder, the Justice Reinvestment Program rules provide that 3% of the funds are dedicated to program evaluation. So when counties submit those applications, they can ask to retain those funds for locally administered evaluations, or they could say, here you go, CJC, we want you to do this. And a little over a year ago, December 2021, I presented the plan that we CJC had for the funds that were remitted back to us for the evaluation projects here. Many of those are up and running and going as intended. I have an update on 2 projects for you today where we've had to change plans around a little bit and wanted to give you a quick update on that. So the first is for the client engagement study. For those of you that remember this one from last time. We've worked with several community corrections directors who have a lot of interest in this and have done some local work around this very topic. It's probably not too much a surprise to this group that clients that engage with their probation officer and their treatment programming are more likely to be successful. And so community corrections departments are saying, hey, we need to ask our clients what the barriers are to engagement in that. And what characteristics are facilitating that. So we wanted to get a robust research plan around that effort to really answer some of those questions and provide insights around that relationship between clients and their probation officers and how to improve that. I think COVID really shined a light on some of those challenges as well. So we've got several counties really interested in this. Very excited to get this project up and running. Our plan was to run it through a procurement process as we have done for similar past projects. And we ran into several delays with that effort. The idea is to have it go through the procurement process, kind of open it up, and either, a national research firm, a nonprofit with a research arm, other research shops can apply for those funds to do the project. That is very much delayed at this point, very much delayed. So we would like to pivot on this one. We reached out to Multnomah County and specifically Department of Community Justice, DCJ, and they have capacity in their research and planning division, both the research capacity to design this and capacity to do the client engagement part. They've really built up their capacity to engage with their own clients, whether it's more of a structured survey or an interview setting. And they were very gracious to say, yes, we could do this project and manage it. And so instead of going through the procurement process, we would like to have our local partners at Multnomah County take it on, work with other community corrections departments to manage that project and get it up off the ground. And so the timeline will be delayed. It's going to get started later than we had hoped, but I think partnering with a local unit that has capacity could be very beneficial in that way. So that was the first update. And then we did have several projects that came in a little bit under budget. And so once we added up the amount of funds that we had left over, there was a little bit left over, and there's one pretty robust project in Lane County that we would like to, doing it again. Thank you, Paige. So the Way Home study out of Lane County has been going for several years. So an evaluation of the effects of permanent supportive housing on housing and recidivism outcomes. The project's been ongoing since September 2018. So you can see here they've had 400 individuals assessed and 185 folks placed in permanent supportive housing post-incarceration. The study's ongoing and enrollment's taking more time than initially estimated. I imagine COVID has had a little something to do with that. And so the plan here is to extend that enrollment period through the end of 2023 and then have the 3-year follow-ups for the housing and recidivism information. So Lane County did already retain their 3% funds this biennium to go towards this study. And the study is quite robust and complex. They're pulling in funding streams from multiple places. So they did keep the 3% funds, that did just a little bit. I believe they have some federal grant funds and pulling in things from different places to get a study this complex, both up and running and then to continue it on for several years and to continue it through COVID. And they're getting close to the finish line and need some additional funds for some graduate folks that work on the project and some of the principal investigators' time. And so since we have the $125K left over of our 3%, and we appreciate the complexity and robustness of this study, would like to contribute it to this project. And that is my update. That concludes the update on those 3% funds.
Any questions, comments?
So I'm assuming we're not voting on this?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, I think when we had the initial plan in December, there was not a vote. It was more of a get your feedback and comments, and we can incorporate that into the plan. And so since we've made some changes, also want to get your feedback and comments and update as well. But since this is not a county application, my understanding is we don't need a vote.
It's not an action item, but I think feedback is what they're looking for.
Well, if it was, I would just declare
Conflict
of interest, because
Yeah.
this is a project.
Well, we have 5 conflicts up here in various counties, so yes. Any feedback for staff? I mean, sounds like a good plan. I mean, nothing's perfect, but it sounds like a good plan. All right. Well, I guess, are we adjourned? What time is it? 3:01.
3:01.
It's 3:01. We're adjourned. Thank you all so very much.
If I could real quick, Commissioners, just by way of being in person for the first time, so one, thank you for kind of giving us the opportunity to experiment in this way. Whether you have feedback now or just continue to provide us feedback as we look at maybe doing this quarterly, as Ken had suggested a while back. We'll start talking about where the next site is and what we can do to improve the experience and or keep it going. I also wanted to kind of, because we're in person, give some of the folks that are in the agency here that you maybe